Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking a really in-depth look at artificial intelligence, and specifically we're focusing on China. So, we've got a really diverse collection of sources here that you've shared with us, covering a whole range of topics. Everything from like the government policies that are shaping the AI sector to the, really amazing technological breakthroughs that are coming out of China. And then, of course, we've got that, that always fascinating US-China dynamic to consider and how that's playing out in the AI world, and even the potential impacts on jobs and employment both in China and globally, really.
Yeah, it's an exciting time to be looking at AI and, focusing on China as you requested makes it even more intriguing, given how rapidly things are changing over there.
Right, and I think what you've put together here with this collection of sources, it's a really nice mix. I mean, we've got this official government document, right, that lays out the new regulations for AI-generated content, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it's really kind of a signal of how seriously the Chinese government is taking this whole issue of, making sure AI development is responsible, and also kind of sets the stage for, how they see the industry evolving.
Then we've got this report from a Guosheng conference, which is really interesting because it brings in the voices of a bunch of different experts from China, people in industry, people in academia. It's a really rich discussion covering technology, policy, all sorts of interesting angles on AI.
Absolutely. I mean, it's great to get that kind of insider perspective, really understand what the key thinkers and leaders in China are thinking about and working on.
And then we've got a bunch of news articles and analyses too, which is always helpful to kind of ground things in what's actually happening, the real world implications of all this. So we've got stuff about, the competition between the US and China in AI, how AI is impacting jobs, some really interesting specifics about, a company called DeepSeek that's kind of emerged as a player.
Right. And even, China's engagement with Africa on AI, which is a whole other dimension to this that's really worth exploring.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've really got a comprehensive picture here, thanks to your great selection of sources. And our mission today, right, is to kind of synthesize all of this, connect the dot, and I know make sense of this whole landscape and what it all means, especially from that China perspective.
Exactly. I think the real value here is in, not just looking at these things in isolation, but seeing how they all fit together, how they inform each other and what that tells us about the bigger picture. So, are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it. Okay, so I think a good place to start is with the policy landscape. We've got this document, the Measures for the Identification of AI-Generated Synthetic Content, or okay, which I understand is set to take effect in September 2025, right? And it's a joint effort from four major departments, which shows you how seriously they're taking it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about sort of slapping a label on things. It's really about promoting, healthy development of AI, protecting rights, maintaining public interest. They're thinking about things like, fake news, the disruption of online ecosystems. It's a pretty comprehensive approach.
So they're talking about two forms of identification here. One is explicit labeling, QIASI, and the other is implicit labeling, QIASI. What's the difference there?
Yeah, so explicit labeling, that's basically, stuff you can actually see. Like, let's say you've got an AI-generated image. There might be a text overlay on it or a little icon or, it's audio, maybe a voice cue that says, hey, this was made by AI, something very clear and visible. Implicit labeling, on the other hand, is more about kind of embedding information within the data itself, like in the metadata of a file. So it's not something the average user would necessarily see, but it's there for, verification purposes, tracking, things like that.
I see. So almost like a digital watermark in a way.
Exactly. And they're connecting this new policy to existing regulations, too. Stuff like the Internet Information Service Algorithm Recommendation Management Regulations and the Generative Artificial Intelligence Service Management Interim Measures. It's all part of a broader framework.
And what's the gist of what they're requiring companies to do? The companies that are actually providing these AI-generated content services.
Well, a couple of key things. First, if the content falls under certain categories that are spelled out in a previous regulation, they have to use explicit labeling. This mostly applies to, content that could be really misleading, deep fakes, things like that. Then, for all AI-generated content, they have to include implicit labeling in the metadata.
Right. So it's a combination of, making it clear to the user and also having that sort of behind-the-scenes tracking.
Right. And it's not just about putting the labels there. They're really cracking down on any attempts to mess with them. So no deleting them, altering them, hiding them. And they're even saying you can't provide tools for that kind of stuff either. They're serious about this.
Yeah, they're putting their foot down for sure. And it's not just this one document, right? There's also a national standard that goes along with it.
Yeah, it's called Network Security Technology Identification Methods for AI-Generated Synthetic Content. Or in Chinese, it's sing, zing, 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 name of it gets into the nitty-gritty, the technical details of how the labeling should actually be done.
So they're really trying to be thorough about this, making sure everyone's on the same page.
Absolutely. They're trying to be proactive and, really get ahead of the curve on this, which is interesting to see.
Okay, so that's the policy side of things. Let's talk about the technology itself. The Guoqin conference report had some really fascinating insights from experts in China who are working on the front lines of AI. There was this guy, Ayat, who had some interesting thoughts about what it really takes to advance AI.
Right. And his point was that it's not just about, bigger and better models or just focusing on, multimodal AI, which is all the rage these days. He's talking about the need for a more holistic approach.
Yeah, he was really emphasizing the importance of integrating different capabilities, right? Like sensing, storage, processing, and control. He's saying you need all of that to really move AI forward.
Exactly. It's about how AI interacts with the world, how it perceives things, how it processes information, how it makes decisions, and actually controls things in the physical world. He's taking a very systems level view of AI, which I think is really important.
He even made the point that, China might already have enough, maybe even too much computing power in its data centers. And his focus is more on like, okay, what are we actually doing with this power? How are we building practical applications?
Right. He's saying, we need to move beyond just the raw horsepower and really focus on the applications, the use cases that are going to make a difference in people's lives, in industry, and society as a whole. And he pointed to China's strength in sensors as a good example of, how they're kind of building from the ground up.
Yeah, he was talking about sensors for, smart vehicles, robots, drones, all that kind of stuff. Areas where China is actually ahead of the game.
Exactly. And his point is that, if you have that strong foundation in sensing, in how AI actually gathers information about the world, that gives you a huge advantage in building more sophisticated systems that can, operate autonomously, make decisions, and really interact with the environment in complex ways.
Okay, then we had Aseo, who brought this really interesting point about the Chinese language itself and how it could actually be an advantage in building secure AI systems.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating argument. He's basically saying that, the Chinese language, with its huge number of characters, it's inherently more complex than, say, English, which only has 26 letters.
Right, right.
And he's arguing that this complexity could actually be a strength when it comes to cybersecurity and AI security. Imagine trying to break into a system that's built on a language with thousands and thousands of characters. It's a much tougher nut to crack than one based on a simple alphabet.
It's almost like, the language itself becomes a form of encryption in a way.
Exactly. And he even proposed this idea of a hand culture knowledge security platform. And he's suggesting, maybe we should embed Chinese characters deeply within our computer systems, make that a core part of our security infrastructure.
So really, really leaning into the uniqueness of the Chinese language and culture as a way to build a more secure digital future.
Absolutely. And he also had some interesting thoughts about, the way the internet is structured. He questioned the whole emphasis on IPv6, which is supposed to be the next generation of internet protocol.
Right.
And he's saying maybe instead of, just following the Western-led path on that, we should be thinking about building a more Chinese language-centric internet infrastructure. So, really kind of shaking things up, challenging the status quo, which is bold.
Yeah, definitely a different way of looking at things. Okay, then we had Oni, who gave us a kind of overview of the domestic AI scene in China. He talked about the role of industry groups, the government's AI Plus initiative, and the rise of homegrown AI technology.
Right. And he highlighted some really interesting trends. The low altitude economy, which is all about drones and, those electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. He sees a lot of potential there, especially in a country as large and geographically diverse as China.
Yeah, and he talked about, humanoid robots too, which is still very much a work in progress, but he sees that as a major area of development going forward.
Absolutely. And of course, he emphasized the need for China to develop its own AI chips, especially given the U.S. sanctions and export controls that we talked about earlier. They want to be self-reliant in that critical area. And then, of course, he highlighted the breakthroughs that are happening in large language models and edge computing.
Right. So a real push for independence and kind of building up that whole ecosystem from the bottom up. Then we have this company, DeepSeek, which seems to be making some waves. Sino had some interesting things to say about them.
Yeah, DeepSeek is really interesting. They're kind of positioning themselves as a disruptor, a challenger to the U.S. dominance in AI. And one of the ways they're doing that is by offering their AI models on a free and open source basis.
Well, a very different approach from, some of the big U.S. companies that are keeping their models pretty tightly controlled.
Exactly. And their argument is that, this open source approach is good for innovation. It's good for spreading the benefits of AI more widely. And it also, helps them get around some of those pesky export controls.
Right, because they're also working with domestic Chinese chip companies, right? So they're really trying to build a kind of independent, self-sufficient AI ecosystem.
Exactly. And it's interesting because there's this philosophical difference too. The idea that DeepSeek's model is more about, benefiting the many as opposed to, a model where just a few powerful companies control everything.
But there were also some reports about, DeepSeek maybe being a little bit cautious, right? Like telling their employees to avoid international travel. And there was something about the Zhejiang government kind of screening investors.
Right, right. So there's definitely a sense of, you know, awareness of the geopolitical situation, the tensions that exist, and maybe a bit of, wanting to keep things a little bit under wraps, not make themselves too much of a target.
Yeah, makes sense. And that kind of leads us into the whole international landscape, right? The competition between the US and China, which is really heating up in the AI space. Pachenbos from the Gorshin conference, he had some interesting insights on how the US is targeting China's AI sector.
Yeah, he was pretty blunt about it. He said the U.S. is trying to slow China down, keep them from becoming too dominant in AI. And he identified a few key areas where they're doing that. One is investment, trying to restrict the flow of capital into China's AI sector.
Right, trying to kind of starve them of resources, essentially.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's the whole supply chain issue, which we've talked about before, especially when it comes to chips. The U.S. is really trying to cut off China's access to the most advanced chips.
Right, and that's a big deal because you need those chips for pretty much everything in AI, from training the models to actually running them.
Absolutely. And then the third area he mentioned was data security. The U.S. is putting in place all sorts of restrictions on data sharing and, how data can be used. And he predicts that this decoupling, the separation between the U.S. and China in AI, it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's going to get any easier anytime soon. And he had some recommendations for China, right? Like how they should respond to all of this.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is to provide clear signals to, companies in the AI sector, kind of give them some guidance on what they should be doing, how they should be preparing. And then he also talked about the potential for leveraging, the fact that a lot of U.S. companies actually have pretty significant operations in China. So, maybe there's some leverage there that China could use.
Right, maybe some ways to kind of push back or create some pressure in the other direction.
Yeah, exactly. And then when it comes to, supply chain disruptions, he suggested using legal tools like anti-monopoly investigations and cybersecurity reviews.
So getting a little bit aggressive maybe in terms of using the legal system to their advantage.
Right. And then finally, when it comes to data, he pointed to DeepSeek's open sourcing approach and some of the things that Zhao Hongshu is doing with data integration as, kind of innovative ways to navigate this challenging landscape.
So kind of thinking outside the box, finding ways to work around the restrictions that the U.S. is putting in place. Okay, then we have Haja Toin, who talked about the global AI landscape as being a kind of a bipolar competition between the U.S. and China. But he also brought in Europe as a third force.
Right. And he said that Europe is playing this really interesting role because they're not necessarily trying to, win the technology race, but they are trying to set the rules of the game.
So kind of shaping the ethical and regulatory framework for AI globally.
Exactly. And they've been pretty proactive about this. They put out some ethics guidelines a few years back, and now they've got this AI Act that they're working on.
Yeah, they're really trying to establish themselves as the kind of ethical leaders in AI, which is a smart strategy, I think.
Absolutely. And they have a lot of leverage because, a lot of companies, both U.S. and Chinese companies, They want to do business in Europe, so they have to, play by Europe's rules.
Right. And he talked about this idea of uh, technology being bipolar, but the rules being multilateral. So you've got these two big powers, the U.S. and China, driving the technological innovation. But then you've got this kind of global effort to set the standards and the regulations.
Right. And he acknowledged that there's some tension there, between the dimensions of multinational companies and the geopolitical considerations of different countries. It's a complex landscape, for sure.
Okay, then we had AZ, who had a slightly different take. He focused on the idea that this competition between the U.S. and China, it's not just about technology, it's about building entire ecosystems.
Right. He's saying, it's not just about who has the best algorithms or the fastest chips. It's about who has the best talent, the best infrastructure, the best support systems for innovation. And he argued that China needs to focus on addressing its own internal challenges, like, data security as the digital divide.
Right, making sure that everyone in China has access to the benefits of AI, not just a select few.
Exactly. And he also talked about the need for China to be more involved in global rulemaking. Not just following the rules set by others, but actively shaping those rules.
So becoming a leader, not just a follower.
Right. And he talked about this idea of a community of shared future. China offering its own solutions and perspectives on how AI should be developed and governed.
So a more collaborative approach maybe than what we're seeing from the US right now.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, it's interesting to see how these different perspectives are playing out.
Now, those were the viewpoints from the Chinese side. We also have these news articles that give us a look at what people in the U.S. are saying about all of this, especially when it comes to the whole issue of export controls.
Right. And there's definitely a lot of debate going on within the U.S. about how effective these controls are. Whether they're too broad, too narrow, whether they're actually achieving their goals.
Yeah, it seems like the general consensus is that, export controls are the right approach, but they need to be better implemented. Like they need to be faster, simpler, more coordinated with allies.
Right. There's this sense that the bureaucracy is kind of slowing things down, and that China is finding ways to work around the restrictions. And there's talk of even tightening the controls further, especially on those really advanced chips like the H20.
And it's interesting because some of the big U.S. tech companies, they're actually kind of on board with this, right? Like OpenAI and Anthropic, they're both in favor of stronger controls on chips.
Yeah, but then you have others like Google who are taking a bit of a different approach. They're saying, maybe instead of just focusing on restricting the chips themselves, we should be thinking about giving the BIS more power, more resources to actually monitor the supply chain and crack down on illegal activity.
So kind of fighting fire with fire in a way, using technology to enforce the controls.
Exactly. And they also want to make the licensing process simpler, because right now it's pretty cumbersome, and that's slowing things down.
And there was this idea floated of chip-level governance, which sounds kind of sci-fi, actually embedding tracking and control mechanisms directly into the chips. But I guess the chip manufacturers weren't too keen on that.
Yeah, it sounds like that idea got some pushback, which makes sense. I mean, that's a pretty radical approach, to actually modify the hardware itself in that way.
And it seems like the U.S. government is considering even more aggressive measures too, right? Like maybe going after the equipment that's used to make the chips, not just the chips themselves.
Right. So there's talk of, restricting the maintenance of equipment that's already in China by companies from Japan and the Netherlands. And then there's also the possibility of, direct sanctions on Chinese chip companies, maybe adding more companies to the entity list.
So really trying to kind of box them in, limit their options on every front.
Absolutely. And it's not just about chips either. There's this whole debate about export controls on what they call AI diffusion, which includes software, cloud services, the models themselves.
Yeah, and it sounds like those controls are probably here to stay. There's even talk of, expanding the list of countries that are considered allies, the so-called tier 1 countries.
Right. And then there's this idea of having a clear path for other countries to move up to tier 1 if they, kind of meet certain criteria. And of course, there's a lot of lobbying going on around this. Like Microsoft wants to see more countries added to tier 1 so they can sell more Azure cloud services.
So it's not just about national security. There's a lot of business interests at play here too.
Absolutely. And you have different companies pushing for different things. OpenAI, for instance, they want a broader tier 1 and stricter controls on infrastructure exports to tier 2 countries. And then Anthropic, they're concerned about this exemption that allows a certain number of high-end chips to be exported without, too much scrutiny. And Google's worried about the burden that all of this is putting on U.S. cloud providers.
So everyone's got their own angle, their own agenda. And then there's even this discussion about, maybe limiting Chinese companies' access to U.S. cloud services altogether.
Right. And there are some good arguments on both sides of that issue. On the one hand, you don't want Chinese companies using U.S. computing power to, develop AI that could be used against the U.S. But then on the other hand, maybe having them reliant on U.S. infrastructure gives the U.S. some leverage.
Yeah, it's a tough call. And then you've got some industry groups in the US that are actually pushing back against these broad controls on software and models. They're saying, maybe it's better to just focus on the hardware.
Right. Like, instead of trying to control the models themselves, which is really difficult, just limit the number of GPUs that can be used in certain data centers. That's a lot easier to enforce.
Makes sense. But then, you've got companies like Anthropic and OpenAI who are worried about protecting their intellectual property, and they want to see those controls on software and models stay in place.
Right. So it's a real balancing act, trying to find the right level of control, something that's effective but doesn't stifle innovation.
And just to add one more layer of complexity, there's even talk of specific actions against DeepSeek, the company we talked about earlier.
Right. So there's a possibility that the U.S. government could ban DeepSeek's software on government devices, maybe even remove their apps from U.S. app stores, and then they could also pressure cloud providers to stop supporting them.
So really trying to kind of shut them down in the U.S. market. But of course, DeepSeek is mostly based in China, so it's not clear how effective that would actually be. And there's also the issue of, potential backlash and legal challenges.
Right. It's a very sensitive situation, and there are a lot of factors to consider.
Okay, so we've talked about policy, we've talked about technology, we've talked about the international competition. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the impact of all of this on jobs, because this is something that, a lot of people are worried about.
Yeah, and there's a lot of speculation, a lot of different predictions out there. Some people are saying, AI is going to take all our jobs. Others are saying, it's going to create new jobs. It's hard to know what we believe.
And we saw some pretty wild predictions from, some of the experts, right? Like Kevin Weil from OpenAI, he was saying that 99% of coding tasks could be automated by the end of 2025. And the CEO of Anthropic, he wasn't much more optimistic. He said 90% within the next few months and almost all of it within a year.
Yeah, those are some pretty bold statements, and it's hard to know how realistic they are, but it does show you that there's a lot of anxiety about this, a lot of concern that AI is going to displace a lot of workers, especially in fields like software development.
And then you have people like Arvind Krishna from IBM who are a little bit more, measured in their predictions. He's saying maybe 20–30% of code could be AI generated, but he still sees AI as a tool, something that's going to make programmers more productive, not necessarily replace them entirely.
Right. So the question is this a case of, AI augmenting human capabilities, or is it going to be outright replacement? And I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. It's going to be different for different jobs, different industries.
Yeah, it's hard to generalize, I think. And one of the ideas that came up was this shift towards managing AI teams. So instead of, just writing code yourself, you might be managing a team of AI agents that are doing the coding.
Right. And that's a really interesting concept. It kind of implies that, the skills that are going to be valuable in the future are going to be more about, understanding how to work with AI, how to direct it, how to kind of guide it towards the desired outcomes.
Right. So those kind of higher level thinking skills are going to be really important. But then we also saw some data points that are a little bit worrisome, right? Like the decline in programmer employment in the US, it's at the lowest level since 1980.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark statistic. And it's hard not to, connect that with the rise of AI coding tools like ChatGPT. It seems like there is some real displacement happening, at least in the short term.
And then I have the example of Klarna, which paused its hiring after implementing an AI chatbot for customer service.
Right. So that's another example of, AI potentially taking over tasks that were previously done by humans. And there's Amazon, which is planning to cut a bunch of management positions, potentially because of AI-driven efficiency.
So the impact is being felt in different ways, different sectors, different levels of the organization. It's not just, entry-level jobs that are at risk.
Right. And I think the key takeaway here is that, everyone needs to be thinking about how AI is going to affect their work. and be prepared to adapt, to learn new skills, to be flexible, because this is a wave that's not going away.
Okay, so let's end on a slightly more positive note. We also talk about China's cooperation with Africa in the AI space, which seems to be a growing area of focus.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not just about, China exporting its technology to Africa. It's about collaboration. It's about building partnerships. It's about knowledge sharing. And they've got a bunch of initiatives going on, like the Kenya Luban Workshop, which is providing training in AI and other digital skills.
Right, and China's also investing in infrastructure in Africa, things like data centers and networks. They're really trying to kind of help Africa build up its own digital capabilities.
Exactly. And it's not just, altruism on China's part. They also see this as a strategic opportunity, to expand their influence, to build relationships, to gain access to new markets.
Right, it's a win-win situation potentially.
Yeah, if it's done right. And it's interesting to see how African countries are responding to this. They're definitely eager to embrace AI, to use it to solve their own challenges, in agriculture, healthcare, education. They see it as a way to kind of leapfrog ahead, to accelerate their development.
And the African Union is on board with this too. They see AI as a key part of achieving their Agenda 2063 goals.
Right. So there's a lot of alignment there, a lot of potential for positive collaboration.
Okay, let's wrap up with some of the expert opinions that we looked at. We had Ochu, who talked about the importance of AI safety governance.
Yeah, and he really emphasized the need to be proactive, to anticipate the risks and challenges that come with AI and put in place the right safeguards, the right regulations.
And he sees China's new regulations on AI-generated content as a positive step in that direction.
Absolutely. He thinks it's a good model, a good example of how to, balance innovation with safety, with responsibility.
And he also stressed the need for collaboration, not just the government doing its thing, but, industry, academia, everyone working together to make sure that AI is developed and used in a safe and an ethical way.
Right. And he's optimistic that China can, kind of set an example for the rest of the world in this area.
Okay, and finally we had EL, who shared his thoughts on the bigger trends in AI, drawing on his experience with Alibaba Cloud and the innovation ecosystem in Hangzhou.
Right. And he's a big believer in the transformative power of AI. He thinks it's more profound than any of the industrial revolutions that came before. He even said that it's not just a tool revolution, it's a scientific revolution.
Yeah, he's really thinking big picture, long term. And he gave this great example of the City Brain project in Hangzhou, how they're using AI to optimize traffic flow, to reduce congestion, to save energy.
Right. And he sees that as a model for how AI can be used to solve real-world problems, to make cities more livable, more efficient, more sustainable.
And he also talked about this analogy of, black soil pasture and blue sky.